So thank you all so much for coming out on this leap day. I really appreciate this wonderful turnout. I'm overwhelmed. I'm Alison Ann Holt-White, and I'm on the program committee of the Manchester by the Sea Museum. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank the people who helped to make this evening possible. The program committee, Mary Minot, who's back there on the desk, Russ Brown, who unfortunately isn't here today, Sue Thompson, who's here, Matthew Swindell, the archivist, who's also here, and board members of the Manchester by the Sea Museum who all dotted around. Special thanks to Nancy Klebart and the Congregational Church for allowing us to use this wonderful hall. And particular thanks to Mary Ann, who's back in the table there, who organized the space and the refreshments, and provided the mushroom napkins. So we're very excited to present the first lecture in our spring speaker series. And I hope some of you have seen the postcard. Did people get the postcard in the mail? Yeah. Anybody get? Oh, only 3. Anybody else? I'm really curious to know if you got the postcard. And there's some extras on the back because there are 3 more talks in this series, 1 a month up until June. So I hope you will all come back for that. We have a range of really interesting topics over the next few months, and you can register for them on our website. And if you didn't get a postcard, please pick one up from the table at the back. So without further ado, Matt Genter is going to introduce our speaker and tell you a little bit about what the museum has been up to.
Yeah! Well, I'd like to thank everyone for attending our first event of the season. Thank you. We're still in our bicentennial year. So in 1823, Abigail built her home, which is now the Trask House and our current location of a museum. And within this year, we've set off on several tasks. One is the reinterpretation of the museum and restoration of the kitchen and parlor were completed in the fall. And this year, we're continuing to work with a room dedicated just to furniture made in Manchester, which is very exciting. We have examples of almost 200 years of furniture created by here in Manchester. And our summer exhibit, I would like to announce, is going to be called Summers by the Sea in the Mascanoma Hotel. So it's something to make sure you're all going to see. So I encourage everyone to visit the museum, and please become a member if you're not already, and think about supporting our capital campaign, which is going on through this capital, the bicentennial year. So tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Gary Gilbert. I met Gary many years ago. He's a fellow architect, and we both worked in Boston. And I visited Gary after he moved up to Manchester, and I saw what a beautiful town it was, and I followed him up here soon after. His interest in mushroom began 40 years ago while he was a grad student at the University of Washington. He serves as on the executive board of the Boston Mycological Club, the oldest mushroom organization in the country. He's the originator of mycocards, flashcards for learning mushrooms by genus, which, if you're interested, there are some for sale out in the back on the way out. And some of his recipes appear in the fantastic fungi cookbook. He's a great cook too, and he loves many mushroom dishes that Gary has made. He periodically leads walks in our local woods, and as you probably know, he's a regular contributor to the Cricket with the Mushroom of the Week articles. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome my friend Gary Gilbert. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, welcome. I hope you all had a chance to taste some of the porcini spread, which is out back. I didn't make any morel spread because I think Tom Kehoe would have eaten all of it. I was asked to do this talk based loosely on an article I wrote in the Cricket about 2 years ago, The Fungi of the 1661 Cemetery. I then wondered, where would I go with these ripe and interesting topics? Cemeteries, history, mushrooms, science, and nature, life and death. So we will wander between fungi and cemeteries and back again. The information here is based on town records, Mary Ellen LaBianca of Gloucester, Jane Bowers of the Wenham Historic Museum, and our own Matthew Swindell, who's a very enjoyable person to work with. This first picture, the image on the left, is from the article a couple of years ago with Amanita muscaria growing, it was flourishing that fall in the cemetery. And on the right, it's actually a mushroom called dead man's fingers. To be clear, it's not a dead man's or woman's fingers. It's actually an ascomycete fungi that grows out of rotting stumps, not from people. The people decayed in about 2 or 3 years. They were done. So let's start with the land we live on. The History of Manchester, one of the most famous books, is by Lamson from 1895. And his text at the very beginning of the book does just what I was learning in elementary school too, was basically diminishing the importance and presence of Native Americans in our area due to their sparse population and the vastness of the untouched forests, somehow justifying all the colonization that was to occur. In fact, these lands were occupied by the Pawtucket Native Americans, a branch of the Pennacook. In 1602, it was written, they were a people tall of stature, broad and grim-visaged, their eyebrows painted white. Their sagamore, or leader, was Masconomet. I don't know why we still use the word Masconomo, but who was centered in Ipswich and was said to be a peaceful person who just traded with the settlers. Now, we don't know whether he was just smart enough to know, let's be peaceful and trade, or whether he was like that naturally, but as far as fungi goes, we don't know if northeastern Native Americans used fungi in their diet, but we have a lot of information about western and plains Native Americans, some of which did eat mushrooms, but a lot of them did use them medicinally, like puffballs to stop bleeding and to carry smoldering fires in polypores from campsite to campsite. There you go. The Puritans came here in 1629 to 1640. That's just a tight little decade of time, and a lot of stuff happened because of them coming here. And that's a good, some good dates to keep in mind. This is a map from 1634, right in the middle of that time, that shows the maritime perspective people had of our region. Just before this map, in 1624, some settlers did come here, didn't last a year, had a tough time of it, and moved to Nonkeg, which is Salem. In 1629, the first ship, called the Talbot, dropped anchor briefly in our harbor, and Reverend Higginson said it was a fine and sweet harbor. I'm sure you all agree. Next year, the Arbella, the famous Arbella, which this is an image of, Arbella anchors in Gales Point, and the Puritan Governor Winthrop was aboard. In 1640, there were 63 people living in Jeffreys Creek. They asked the court to give them the power to erect a village, which was granted. 5 years later, the villagers requested the name Manchester. They probably came from Manchester, England, I guess. I'd like to know the answer for that one. So this is an image of the cemetery gates. It clearly was used for burial ground before it was official. The grave markers were almost certainly of wood and rotted away. Burials back then were always put away from rivers. Rivers were really, really important back then because we had mills on just about every river in the region. And they would put on hard to cultivate land, rocky land, exactly like the 1661. It was first mentioned in town records that they were using Samuel Friend's land in 1661, so that's how it got its name. This is a great map. I've zoomed in for hours on this thing, and all the names of the houses. Really fascinating. You should go to the museum. 7 years later, in 1668, the land was officially exchanged with Samuel Friend for land on Sawmill Brook and School Street, which is right where there's a culvert there, where the brook crosses under. He is to have a neck of land that lies between the sawmill and his island. So apparently he may have owned a little bit of land there, and it was much wetter or marshier, the streams were much bigger. But he was given a good chunk of land and he could start his mill up that year, as best as we can tell. I even found that there was mills on Wolf Trap Brook, like across the street from my house. And we always wondered why there was these big mounds of earth on either side of the stream, but it makes sense to me now that that used to be a mill. In 1717, they voted to fence in the cemetery. And everybody in town had to help fence in the cemetery, or they were assessed a 3-shilling fine. So a little bit of research led me to believe that a shilling was equal to a person's wages for a day. Now, if you translate that to our median income up here, it's just shy of $1,200 a person. Perhaps there's a lesson to be learned here about acting together as a commonwealth to solve our housing and other issues. We could use a dose of that spirit of self-sacrifice today. In 1730, they voted to build a stone wall around the cemetery. So our stone wall is 294 years old. We should have a wall party sometime. 200 years later, right after the Civil War, Enoch Crombie had the bright idea to plant pine trees there that would later break and fall on the stones. The eastern white pine that he planted, it's estimated that the northeast of the United States had about 3.4 billion cubic feet of it that was logged out. Our trees in the cemetery should be, some of them, 165 years old. I'll say more about the pines later. I heard some sad news today about them. It's very sad. In the 1890s, they decided to widen Summer Street going towards Gloucester, so some of the graves were moved to Rosedale Cemetery. So let's move to what's actually in the cemetery. In high school, I used to love slate gravestones and all the different poems on them and weird ways they would carve them and put lettering in. Memento Mori is about remembering death. To understand gravestone symbolism means understanding something about the Puritans. They called themselves the church, not the Puritans back then, 1629, 1640. Their influence lasted a full century, 5 generations. Their messages were simple, grim, strict, fearful. They believed in predetermination, which means when you were born, somebody somewhere already knew whether you were going to heaven or not, and it didn't matter what you did. And the theory is that they assumed that if you were wealthy, you were probably predetermined to go to the good place. So therefore, you have this Puritan work ethic that evolved. Is work hard, become as rich as you can, and you'll have a better chance of going to up there. They were very anti-aristocracy and anti-royalty. They considered themselves professors, not clergy. But really, they replaced the Catholic Church hierarchy and its own complicated structure with their own form of very doctrinaire and strict interpretation of the Bible. They did not tolerate any other religious sects. They wore black academic attire, not white clergy robes. They had no organs in their churches. They had simple churches. They forbade celebrating Christmas, up until a point. H.L. Mencken wrote of the Puritans, they seem to have the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy. The towns were ruled by the selectmen. Eli. A person had to have permission to move here. Permission. And you had to be part of the church. There was no exceptions. They wrote laws and rules that were very extensive, and starting around the 1660s, which dictated everything about life, including how we dressed. As late as 1767, here was an order that a nearby town selectman gave to their constable. Caleb Kimball, you are hereby required forthwith to warn and give notice to the Bootman family that they, each and all of them, immediately depart the town of Wenham. I heard tell that some families were flogged to leave towns and then flogged at the next town for whatever they did wrong to keep on leaving. But, on the upside, the Puritans founded the Boston Latin School in 1635, right in the middle of their emigration. Oops. And then Harvard, 1 year later, 1636. At this point in time, 30% of England was literate. And in 1642, they passed laws that required the heads of households and fathers to teach their wives and their children to read. They wanted them to read the Bible and to read the laws they were enacting. And they established dame schools where they could hire teachers to teach the children. So the Charlestown stonecutter, an unknown person, but he's who they accredit this work of art with the skull and the wings. He invented this around in the late 1600s, and it was used for about a century. The aspiration of the flight to heaven. One of my favorite sayings that I remember from high school, from gravestones: "Gaze on, my friend, as you pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be. Prepare for death and follow me." And there's different versions of that one, but I was lucky enough in my research to find the perfect response. "To follow you, I'm not content until I know which way you went." So the oldest stone in the cemetery is said to be from 1714. I could not find it, but these were some of the older ones I could find. The one on the left, I wrote it exactly as it was carved into the stone, and you wonder why they capitalized some words and put them in small case for other words, and why they abbreviated important ones, but not ones that weren't so important. And if you look at a lot of these stones, sometimes the words just ran right across, and then they smashed into the edge of the stones, and they abbreviated like crazy. There was letters above and below. It's fascinating folk art. Death is a debt to nature due, which I have paid, and so must you. So, over time, the cherubim wings evolved. It started around 1680 to 1700, more popular around the mid-1700s. This is 3 or more generations since the Puritans moved here, and you were finally allowed to show a personal effigy, I guess is the right term, a resemblance of a human face there. Again, the aspiration that you might fly to heaven. The Tappins and Hoopers and Tewksburys were big names in town and big names in the cemetery. There was 3 generations of Tappins in the cemetery. One was a Revolutionary War vet. He ran a store in town and was known for practical jokes. The Hoopers had a big family, as we know. Captain Hooper died in 1823. The Tewksburys, they're all over the cemetery and they're married like crazy, but they're all gone as far as I could tell from town records. So then the willows evolved around 1750, 1780. They're a symbol of sorrow and mourning, and the urn is one of holding your dust, your ashes, symbol of immortality. And I believe it's because as you get further and further away from the Puritans moving here, you're allowed to express personal grief. So the fundamentalism of the Puritans slowly began to fade. Beliefs became more diverse, less conservative, more tolerant over time. The concept that most of us went down there instead of up top morphed into most of us would go to heaven. When young Jacob Tewksbury died at 5 years old, Rebecca and Jacob in 1801 put on his stone, "The grave is near, the cradle seen, the moment swiftly passed between." So here's some of the residents. It's a party. The Allens are there, the Tewksburys, the Binghams, the Goldsmiths, the Ingersolls, and even a Gilbert. Not from my family. The Allens had 3 family members in the Revolutionary War, and the Lee family had 1. The Goldsmiths lived right near the cemetery. Across the street there was a series of Goldsmith houses. Richard Goldsmith died in 1673 from a lightning strike. I found in town records there is a Goldsmith in town. Does anybody know Mr. or Mrs. Goldsmith? I went to his house. Oh, we'll have to talk. There's one living in town. I left a note on his door. I'm really curious to know, were they German? Were they English? Were they actually Goldsmiths? Anyhow, they were here way back when, right on Summer Street. Anecdotally, the Gilberts, I live at the foot, for 22 years, I lived at the foot of the hill on University Lane, not knowing that that used to be called Gilbert Hill. Because the Gilberts lived in Magnolia. and most of them are buried over in Magnolia, but we have at least one in our cemetery. After over 200 years, the cemetery is filled up and there's no more burials. Stop, my friends, and take a view of the cold grave allotted you. Remember well that you must die and turn to dust as well as I. So let's move to what actually grows on the stones, the good stuff. Lichen are everywhere. It's a pretty big number to say 8% of the world is covered in lichen. Most of it is in the Arctic areas. They're categorized, there's so many kinds of lichens, it's dizzying. They're characterized by what they grow on, their substrate, so they really like stone, but they also like wooden fences and trees and leaves. They even put some Xanthoria elegant on a spaceship on purpose for 2 weeks in space to see if it would survive, and it did. Some lichen live to more than 3,000 years old. Click. There. So, in elementary school, I was taught this is a beautiful example of symbiosis. They're happily living together. But to me, this looks more like prisoner and prison guard and prisoner, or whatever you want to call it. They're highly specialized fungal jailers that holding a plant or algae as a prisoner. But in this case, the jail cell door is left open because they can leave if they wanted to, but the algae here don't want to leave because they are too sensitive to sunlight and they would die. So they're happy with the housing, the thallus it's called, that the fungus, the hyphae of the fungus provide for them. The algae are very light sensitive, but they produce sugar, something fungi crave and cannot produce. And the fungi create a cortex or a skin, often it's colored for various reasons. And they provide shade, they get water vapor out of the air and provide water for the algae. They provide nutrients and minerals, and they get sugars as payback. So this is just a couple of really dramatically different shaped lichen. The fruticose ones look like branches, and I have an example up here of one from the west coast that's really, really common. They grow like Spanish moss out west. Litharia vulpina, and it actually can poison wolves and foxes if you want to use it that way. The one that you're probably all familiar with, the British soldiers, is a type of fruticose fungi. They're common here and they're common everywhere. And then there's these foliose ones that look a lot like leaves, and then these sort of teeny tiny versions of foliose, these squamulose ones that are like teeny tiny leaves. And the British, gotta love the British, they give common names to all sorts of fungi and lichen. So you get the wolf lichen, the green shield lichen, and the tree stipple scale. And it's kind of interesting too, the dates of all these being named, what was going on in science and naming of creatures in the world, all paralleled the inhabitants of the cemetery. So here's one last type, the crustose lichen, which is these are the ones that tend to grow on stones, and they're really beautiful. Some of them can look just like someone spilled paint on the stone, and some of them break up into plates, like this areolate crustose, fairly common. This one here has an edge to it that's sort of foliose, slightly. And this one here, this endolithic crustose, goes in deep into the stone, actually helps break it up more than any other lichen, and gets minerals from inside the stone. So this one I shot from our tombstone, and there's a number of these out there in our cemetery, of these maritime sunburst lichen. I don't know who named these, but they had a good time. It's really pretty. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. How do I go back? Do I go back? Yeah. You can sort of see in the middle these little cups that are sort of orange. Well, those are what they call the apothecia, and these are basically a type of ascomyces. So they release their spores from these little cups. So you might see these cups. It's still the same state lichen. And these here, the one on the right, this Thompson's rosette. There's a number of them in our cemetery. This I did not find here, but it's so beautiful. It's from a limestone gravestone, limestone sunburst. We do have some limestone stones there. So let's move to what's beneath the stones, back to the cemetery for a bit. I don't know how many of you might have heard of this TED Talk that was given about mushroom burial suits. This woman who was an artist who went to MIT, she got 1.5 million hits on her TED Talk. She sold 60,000 mushroom burial suits at about $1,500 each. And her goal was breeding a unique strain of mushroom that promotes environmentally friendly tissue decomposition, that accelerates decomposition and cleanses you of toxins. But the mycelia that she wove in, and this person's not dead, by the way, he's just posing. That's the suit. And the mushrooms she chose to use were oyster mushrooms and shiitake mushrooms. Well, we buy those at the store to eat because they're familiar names and they're warm and fuzzy, but they're going to decay the casket at best, not your body. And as one reviewer said very aptly, it's hard to improve on nature. So then a good friend of mine, Eugenia Bone, who lives in New York City, writes for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and she's written a number of cookbooks of which she and I were in this one cookbook together, and she wrote a story that was published for a couple of consecutive Easters, Decomposition and Easter Story, where she debunks the whole idea of this mushroom burial suit. She said, the moment you stop oxygenating your blood and your immune system stops, there's enough bacteria and microorganisms in your body to chow down. They're ready, willing, and able. And a mushroom suit is not even needed, nor is the chemistry of your body ready for them, because at first, well, not to get too gross, you're kind of wet at the beginning. Not until you dry out that things are more interesting for them. Your acidity increases, your cells collapse, bacterial growth takes off. There's a lot of factors that affect how quickly one decays in the soil, but you'd probably be better off just stuck in the soil. The pH of the soil, the depth of your burial, which reflects on aeration, etc. All these factors have an effect. She said in her article, sad as death is, it is also an opportunity. There is life after death, and it's mainly microbial. So, what are we doing here with all these cemeteries? Do we have enough room for them? The United States, we used to think we had tons of room because we think of the plains, but we live in the coast, and the coasts are filling up, right? So it's something to think about. In Europe, as far as I understand, in Germany, they don't go more than about 25 years without digging up the graves and reusing the cemeteries and putting the bones in ossuaries. And it would seem to me, 50 years or so, plenty of time. Anybody who knew you isn't around anymore. Move on. But it's a Victorian sort of era concept of having beautiful, idyllic cemeteries, and Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge is just phenomenal. I mean, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous place, and the landscaping, the plantings, it's just a phenomenal place. Everybody should go visit it. But not all cemeteries are like that, and they take up a lot of land, more and more land as time goes by. So, there are other alternatives, and I won't go into. I was going to, but then I thought it was, might be a little frightening. But there are other concepts that have been developed. The idea of recomposition, cremation, we're familiar with, aquamation, reef burial, conservation burial. There's a lot of different approaches towards burying the dead. So how did we get to 6 feet deep? It was the plague. It was. 1665 to 1666, pretty similar dates to our cemetery. The plague took out 20% of the population of London. It killed more than 75,000 people, all because of Yersinia pestis, this little bacteria that was living on fleas, that lived on rats, that lived in the sewage and the squalor of the city. Hats off to our DPW for keeping our city clean. So the idea there was to not let air possibly pass over the bodies and spread the plague. So they buried a person as deep as they could go, as deep as a man could lift a shovel over his head and get the dirt out. So that's 6 feet deep. Well, for me it would be 5 feet. And prior to this, people were buried in shallow graves. They were buried in 2 or 3 feet deep. Native Americans probably put you on a little platform and let the birds have at you. I don't mind that idea. And then after the plague came and went, they realized it was pretty time-consuming and expensive to dig such a deep pit, so they started going back to shallower graves again. And then grave robbing came around. Someone's going to be talking about that soon at the museum. Well, that came around because scientists were active as heck, and they were trying to research bodies. Bodies rotted quickly. They didn't have, big refrigeration or what's the word? Embalming techniques. So they started digging graves deeper again. But then that stopped, particularly where Massachusetts led the charge. In 1831, we passed the Anatomy Act, which allowed scientists to use unclaimed bodies from the morgue, so to take the pressure off of grave robbing. Right now, there's no legal depth requirements in most places in the country, and in our town, we have a standard, really, of 4 feet deep, and you have to be in some sort of closed something. Open to discussion, perhaps. So, we're not Egyptians anymore. The Egyptians felt that if your body had to be preserved if you were going to live in the afterlife, so you had to be eternally preserved to eternally live in the afterlife. Why are we still doing what we're doing? I guess we're doing it out of tradition, out of dignity, out of respect, and those are valuable values. But a funeral costs, about $10,000. It uses up over 4 million gallons of embalming fluid a year. Stuff you never wanted to know about. 20 million board feet of wood, 64 tons of steel annually, 17 tons of copper and other metals. Cremation, which is becoming more and more popular, right now about 43% of us are choosing that, and it's a growing percentage, costs as low as around $700, uses 28 gallons of fuel, about 1900 degrees for just a couple hours. And then there's these concepts of green burials, if you have permission, to just go a couple of feet deep and wrapped up in a shroud. I like that idea. And no animal has ever dug up, there's no evidence that animals ever dug up anybody if they were deeper than 2 feet. That was a little fact I learned. So enough with graves, let's finally move back to fungi. Favorite subject. So what are fungi? Mushroom, we call all fungi mushrooms. They're not interchangeable words, in fact. The fungus lives in the soil. There's as many as 320 miles of hyphae. The fungi is made of hyphae. It's nothing but hyphae. These strands and threads that fluids pass through. And occasionally, if we're lucky, it'll produce a fruiting body that may or may not be edible and may or may not come back next year. Very frustrating. But the fruiting bodies, the fungi, have an element in them called chitin, which is the same thing that's in lobster shells. And it's what gives them some strength. Because they're, unlike cell-made creatures, they're made from hyphae, so they need some sort of a stiff outer wall, and that's what the chitin provides. Click. Oh, it's not clicking. Okay. So the fungi break down into 3 main groups. Parasitic fungi, and which are the smaller amount of fungi in the world. Mycorrhizal fungi, the ones that are truly symbiotic with plants and trees, and saprobic fungi, the ones that decay things. When I was a kid, my dad used to say, if you see mushrooms in the lawn, step on them because they're killing the grass. But that was just because he didn't know how to take care of his lawn. They had nothing to do with killing his grass at all. So here's a couple of parasitic fungi. Another article I wrote for the Cricket, I don't know, a little while ago, it was a fun article about that movie, The Last of Us, where cordyceps fungi, this parasitic fungi, would actually attack humans. Yeah. There are parasitic fungi, there are cordyceps, but it takes them about tens of millions of years to develop the capability of attacking one specific species of insect. So this ant from Colombia has this one type of Ophiocordyceps that knows how to attack it. And they do turn them into zombies, and there's something called summit disease. This will spook you. They control the brains of the insect and get them to climb to the highest part of the branch of the twig or bush they're near. And then they latch on and die, and the little stem comes up and releases their spores. Summit disease. They're very good at this. And they can do it to tarantulas, they can do it to beetles, there's all sorts of insects. And they also live around here, cordyceps. But they're not going to bother any of you at all. But you can find cordyceps here too. And then there's another famous parasitic fungus, the one that created the potato famine in Ireland. Now, if the Irish had any Peruvian ancestry, they would have known, don't plant one species of potato. You know, the Peruvians plant 80 to 150 species, I think, and they're totally nuts about potatoes. But the Irish made the mistake of planting one species, and the only way to combat a fungal infection is to breed a new species of potato. You can't put a dust on it or any concoction. It's a fungus, it's systemic, and it was a very sad story what happened in Ireland. And they developed other strains of potatoes. Click. You're gonna click, aren't you? Yes. No. And then there's saprobic fungi, some of the fun ones. Some of them are edible, most of them are not edible because they're just too tough. Some of them are poisonous, most of them aren't. But what we have growing around here last year, particularly tons of chicken of the woods. And we have reishi, these shelf bracket fungi that grow out of our hemlocks and pines, foliotas, and the glow-in-the-dark Omphallotus illumens, the jack-o'-lantern mushroom. They're all decayers. And decaying fungi are great because those are the ones sold in the grocery stores to eat. Those are the ones you can cultivate because you can, chomp up a bunch of wood dust and sawdust and wood chips and grow them in that substrate. So and then we'll go to the funnest, the best one of all, the mycorrhizal fungi. And the term mycorrhizal comes from myco for fungi and rhizal for root. And these are some really well-known photos in the mushroom world. This is a pine tree trying to grow in sterile soil. And this is a pine tree growing in soil where they took soil from already existing pine tree areas and mixed that soil in so the fungus was in the soil and they could develop a relationship. Pine trees can't exist without a fungal partner anywhere. And they hardly exist at all in the southern hemisphere, just about zero. And there's funny stories where they tried to cultivate them in New Zealand and they brought some pine trees in and planted them, and they died in a year, and you can sometimes see toilet paper plantations. There are these squares on the hillside of just pine trees. And they figured out finally they had to bring soil in. Click. So, fungi have relationships with 95% of all the grass, the sedges, the plants, the bushes, the vegetables, just everything that's photosynthetic in the world, most of it, has a relationship with fungi. They're really, really good at water, at transporting water. I used to think their roots, the tree roots and rootlets did a great job, but in fact they do a pretty poor job. They don't contact nearly as much soil as their mycorrhizal partner would allow them to do. The trees produce sugars through photosynthesis, and the sugars, a lot in the science jargon we refer to as carbon or C, and the C transfer goes all over the place in the forest floor, through the forest floor, because of the mycorrhizal, the system of hyphae in the soil. So this is from a lecture by Suzanne Simard, who wrote the book The Mother Tree, where she was documenting the transfer of carbon from trees to trees. In this case, it was really surprising that Douglas firs in the Pacific Northwest were transferring sugars through the mycelial network, not to baby Douglas firs, but to a completely different species of tree, to aspens, to help them grow, because they were being overshadowed by the forest. There's an 80%, 30% split that goes on here. 80% of the nutrients the trees get, the phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, sulfur, and other minerals, are because of the enzymes the fungi release in the soil and break it down and share it with the trees. And 30% of the carbon, or the sugars that the trees produce, goes to the fungi. And this gets very complicated really quick, and there's a lot we don't know about it. But we do know that in a given year, any tree will have 12 to 24 fungal partners. From spring to summer to fall, and even in the winter, they'll change. And some fungi are really good at sort of holding back the phosphorus and nitrogen to get more sugar out of the trees. We used to think this was a happy little sort of hippy-dippy world of sharing and caring, but I think we're beginning to realize there's a lot of players in the soil besides just the hyphae of the fungi. There's also bacteria involved and certain aspects of the soil itself. So it's more of an individual, sympathetic, parallel series of selfish acts is another way of looking at So let's go back to the cemetery. And these are I saw some photos just tonight of some more tree damage in our cemetery, but Mr. Crombie, way back when, who planted those pine trees, what was he thinking? It's sad every time I see those trees fall, and you wonder, white pines are so brittle, they'll snap in half sometimes, or they'll lose big limbs, yet they live 160 to 350 years. I don't understand how that works. I live in a neighborhood of really tall white pines, and I love them, but how do they live that long when they're so brittle? It's a bit of a mystery. I think the DPW does a pretty good job of their attitude. I think is to prune them, to limb the trees mostly in their lower portions and just keep the higher branches with needles on them up high. But still, we know the effects. And let's see. I found on these broken limbs here that there was a secondary fungus that came into whatever wound was going on that allowed that limb to break off. And that was the, where am I here? Sorry. The green elf cup. Cute little guy. And I have one of them right over here. This is, you can see the green color of the wood on the heater over here. This wood has been known since the 1400s, and they would use it as in parquetry and marquetry on furniture. Like it grows on hardwoods as well as conifers, so it was nicknamed the green oak is one nickname for it. And here the Bacchus was inlaid with it. He's the giver of wine, giver of ecstasy, and the god of wine. Good guy. And rarely do you see their apothecia, their fruiting bodies here. These are another form of vasculoplasty that, well, that's for another lecture. But you will quite often see the green-colored wood, and not that often their fruiting bodies. So this is a mushroom I got to mention to you, because as you guys are going to all become mushroom researchers after this, you're going to run into the corpse finder, and it won't be found in our cemetery. But it's a pretty curious little thing. It's a hebeloma, which I always found to be a really spooky name. And most of the hebelomas are poisonous, but they grow on the soil from the already rotted mammal that was buried rather shallow. So they found it in Japan around cats and dogs that were not deep, not very deep, into something they call the CDI, the cadaver decomposition island, where nitrogen is released in the soil and the mushrooms come in and take advantage of it. So what makes the pine trees so healthy in our cemetery? It's certainly not the bodies buried there, it's the fungi. If I can get to the next slide, successfully. So, as we start to wind this down, if Rusty Brown was here, he would say, "What is it? Can I eat it?" He was on a walk with me once I'll never forget. So the answer is yes, 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 but why would you bother? No, and yes. And again, you can see some of the years. Linnaeus named so many things in nature. That guy must have been something. And and Peck is famous from New York State. And these guys were named, again, while people were still burying people in the 1661. Click. So the man on horseback. Why was it named the man on horseback? Well, its nickname also was the Yellow Knight, because the belief was that it was reserved for knights and peasants couldn't eat it, and if you're riding on a horseback, it's so brightly colored yellow, you can easily spot it as you're riding through the woods and stop and pick them. Apparently they're really tasty, and I've never eaten one yet, but I do mean to. Another thought about them is maybe as they get older and their caps turn brown, not yellow, and they start to look like a saddle, but I think that's far-fetched. So this one here, the chicken fat mushroom, it's a type in the porcini family. Its pseuilus are kind of slimy, as their caps usually slimy if they're wet. These are easy to identify because they've got a yellow cap, yellow pores, yellow stem. But these guys have almost always some sort of red tuft on their cap. Maybe just a few, but they'll have them. And any of you who have white pines in your lawn will probably have Pseuilus americanus growing there in the fall. If you're going to eat them, I would dry them first. It makes them a lot less slimy, and then they'll be fine to do a stir fry. This is so good. So this one's interesting. Again, back to how these function mycorrhizally with white pines. This is, they call the deceiver, Locaria lacata. It's almost a weed when you're hunting mushrooms. You see them everywhere. And when they're young, they have nice, well-behaved caps with nice regular profile to them, sort of dome shape with nice margins around the cap. But as they get older, they spread out and can get waterlogged, and their color can change depending on how wet they are or not. The margins of the cap can split. But these do something kind of interesting. Not all mushrooms do this. They're actually killers. They will emit a toxin to kill these little springtails, these little snow fleas, which I've seen plenty of times cross-country skiing on the top of the snow. Well, they get killed and then digested with the enzymes of the mushroom and shared with the white pine trees. I know, kind of creepy, huh? We should really be giving this talk the 30th of October. And the painted swillis is really, really common. It's quite edible, slightly lemony tasting, but it's in the Porcini family also. It's got the yellow pores like its cousin, Swillis americanus, but it's got some very telltale red tufts of furry tissue on the cap, and you can see yellow flesh through the breaking plates of it. As it gets older, it can sort of bleach out and be more white, but it's got some distinctive features. They're pretty easy to identify. And the partial veil here that connects the tissue from the stem to the cap is very cobwebby, which is not a typical thing for other Porcini family members. It's a decent edible, and you can get baskets of these. Well, I can tell you where, anywhere. Every single park in town will have them. And then finally, wrapping this up, we get to the wonderful Amanita muscaria. It was actually named in 1256. It's a long time ago. It's famous, its red and yellow version, red with white dots version, is the famous Mario Brothers mushroom. Those don't grow on the East Coast. They grow in the Rockies and West. And they're in all sorts of children's books and all sorts of toys, and they're just everywhere. Sometimes we have an East Coast yellow version, which sometimes can get red and sort of trick you. But generally speaking, they are yellow or orange. They're really pretty, and they grow like crazy all around here. Their nickname is the fly agaric because they used to chop them up and put them in a bowl of milk and keep them in the kitchens in the medieval days to keep the fly population down. The thought is that since they're hallucinogenic, that the flies trip out and drown or whatever they do. But I've tried it once, it didn't work, but I'm going to try it again. And then there's the famous legend of the Amanita muscaria from Siberia, where they have a long tradition of using it medicinally in a lot of different ways, including pain salves that you can put on topically on your skin. But supposedly they would let the reindeer and deer do eat these quite often. I've seen tons of deer tooth marks on these Amanita muscaria. But apparently the reindeer would eat them, and they would drink the urine of the reindeer and then have a trip. And that's how Christmas was born. So the chemicals in them are ibotenic acid and muscimol, and like all mycomedicines or hallucinogens that you get in mushrooms, it's all a question of dosage. You've got to figure it out, and it's kind of tricky, because any given fruiting of Amanita muscaria can have 10 times as much muscimol in it in the fall as it does in the spring. So it's also varies based on season of the year. The ibotenic acid is supposedly producing joy and beauty and wonder. It's also a neurotoxin, but it won't kill you. And then muscimol is the psychoactive part, where the dosage is more forgiving. They can work supposedly on migraines or for anxiety and muscle pain. But I've only known 3 really advanced mushroomers who've eaten these to try to get high on, and let's see. One of them felt no effects, the other one felt nauseous, and the other one just had a headache. So to bring this thing home, let me see. Oh, you're gonna click? Okay. So there's lots of life going on in the cemetery. The trees are healthy, the fungi are healthy. They live in a successful symbiotic community. Peace and harmony does exist, it seems, and it's in the cemetery. Thank you.